Before I get started with this lecture, I'm going to briefly outline one of the most common or basic moral views in the Western world today. We could call it the basic view, the common view, or the relative consequentialist view. It doesn't matter. They're all accurate. Many people in the Western world oscillate between relativism and consequentialism. Alan Bloom explains the first feature of this basic morality concisely. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering university believes, or says they believe, that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, you can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition as not self-evident astonishes them, as though we were calling into question 2 plus 2 equals 4. Western people will typically only shift from their baseline relativism to consequentialism when a potentially moral issue pushes them. Sometimes something will be so bad that a basic person has to make a moral assessment despite their relativism, and they temporarily become some kind of consequentialist. When this happens, basic people show their true colors, the colors that sleep under the relativism security blanket. If the moral issue affects them negatively, they may shift towards ethical egoism and see things that hurt them as immoral. If the moral issue affects others, they may start utilitarian reasoning. A lot of us know our moral reasoning is basic, but what many of us don't realize is that this basic morality is wildly contradictory. At first glance, this may not be troubling, but if you're basic, it should be. Because our moral decisions can be the most important decisions of our lives, yet many of us are content to make these decisions using a potentially broken moral calculator. Even if this basic hybrid view doesn't apply to you, think about the inconsistencies as they are revealed in the course of this class. You may find a better way, but then again, maybe this course will drive you deeper into skepticism and into this basic moral theory. If by the end of this course you think to yourself, my moral calculator may be broken, but it's the best one there is, you may still be better off than having never inspected it. At least you'll know two things. Your moral calculations might be wrong, and there are other ways to arrive at moral conclusions. If you think this is the beginning of an attack on this moral view, you're right. But this isn't a personal attack. I'm not attacking you. I'm attacking the theory, and we'll attack every theory, to some degree. They all have their challenges. Ultimately, we'll need to recognize the blemishes in our own moral lenses, and figure out if we need to replace them theoretically, or compensate for them practically. If this doesn't sound too daunting, let's get started with our first two moral views of this class: relativism and divine command theory. Plato and Nietzsche are two of the most famous names in philosophy. Plato is basically the heavyweight champion, but his title is somewhat disputed. For example, Nietzsche was very critical of Plato, and many of Plato's doctrines have been challenged over the centuries, but Plato's influence can't be overstated. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato. Nietzsche is a famous and diverse thinker in his own right. Many pass him off as a mere anti-Christian and ignore him. But like the controversial psychologist Jordan Peterson says, "Don't throw away a whole book because one thing offends you. Separate the wheat from the chaff, so you don't miss out on something else that may be great. Because, like him or not, Nietzsche is one of the greats." In this lecture on relativism and divine command theory, we're going to look at our text selection of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, and two of Plato's works, the Theaetetus and the Euthyphro, as historical examples and challenges to these theories. Nietzsche's work presents us with what is called perspectivism, which honestly may only be relativism with extra steps. But Plato's Theaetetus presents us with an epistemic relativism that may serve as a good stepping off point to introduce the problems with relativism in general. After covering relativism and some standard objections, I'll introduce divine command theory and some challenges posed by the Euthyphro dilemma. As a spoiler, every view we'll discuss in this course has its problems, and we won't ignore them. That would be unphilosophical. We're going to start this section on relativism with some background on our text selection of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. The views of morality Nietzsche describes here can also be found in some of his other works, especially his Genealogy of Morals. And for a thinker who's averse to systems, we can sometimes make out systems of thought in his work, and this is an example. The types of morality that Nietzsche identifies at the beginning of our selection is master morality and slave morality. He looks at specific examples of where and when these originate in his Genealogy of Morals. He identifies master morality in ancient Greece. When morality is determined by rulers, the spectrum is described as good and bad. Everything that is proud, exalted, noble, and honest is good. Everything opposite, humble, lowly, base, dishonest, is bad. Therefore, on master morality, to say good and bad is the same as saying noble and despicable. When morality is determined by the ruled, the spectrum is good and evil. Those who are cowardly, timid, insignificant, and desire mere utility are despised by the courageous, confident, and influential people, the rulers, who don't want mere utility. Rulers are the kinds of people who want victory, success, and honor, and by nature will not settle for mere utility. He identifies slave morality in the rise of Christianity, where social perspectives cease to favor strength, capability, wealth, and other kinds of success, and instead require sympathy, kindness, patience, and humility for the attainment of honor. From Nietzsche's point of view, modern or Christian values pervert the traditional values, making the pitiful the depraved, and ignoble the good, and the strong, successful, and noble the evil. People will play the victim in this modern environment to appear good, a kind of dishonesty that traditionally good people would never engage in. As an example, Matthew 5, 3 through 10 lists qualities of the blessed, and they're antithetical to all of the qualities of the good according to master morality. Master and slave morality both embody Nietzsche's concept of will to power, that is, the natural drive to overcome, not merely survive, like on the Darwinian account. It is will to power that motivates the strong to overcome the weak by courage, force, and self-respect, and it's also will to power that motivates the weak to overcome the strong, using public shame, insult, and dishonesty. Nietzsche seems to favor master morality, but not because it is necessarily better, but perhaps because he sees it as more life-affirming and more beneficial to the individual. The alternative being the sacrifice of our own flourishing for the flourishing of society. There doesn't seem to be an absolute truth or absolute morality on his view, but he does seem to think that the next stage of human evolution will include an individual's ability to overcome social forces, to construct individual moralities. Turning back to the Plato readings, the guiding question of Plato's Theaetetus is, what is knowledge? Making it primarily epistemological work, but it contains an argument that can benefit us in this discussion. At one point in the dialogue, Socrates brings up Protagoras' doctrine that man is the measure of all things. In the context of his discussion with Theaetetus, this could mean what all people believe is true is knowledge, or it could mean what each person believes is true is knowledge. The first is obviously fallacious, since at one time all people believed that the earth was flat, but that didn't make it true, and thus not knowledge. The second option, that what each person believes is true is knowledge, is basically the basis of relativism. In the context of knowledge, it could be expressed, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. There is no absolute truth. In the concept of morality, it could be expressed, what's right for you is right for you, and what's right for me is right for me. There is no absolute truth of morality. As we've seen already, epistemic relativism is highly problematic. I mean, can you really say someone is right when they say that 2 plus 2 equals 5? It doesn't seem so. However, in the context of morality, it isn't so clear. The typical intuition is, who is anyone to say that one moral belief, custom, or lifestyle is better or worse than any other? But this becomes shaky when we look at how people actually live, behave, and speak. Even relativists say some things are worse than others. Nietzsche seemed to prefer master morality, for example. And if one way of life is morally equal to any others, then all we can say about Adolf Hitler, Ted Bundy, or Jeffrey Epstein is that their lifestyles and behaviors were different, but not morally worse from our own. And that really doesn't seem to sit right with our intuitions. There are more fundamental difficulties with all forms of relativism, however. Another way to define relativism that is entailed by the other definitions we've used so far is, there are no absolute truths in the epistemological sense, and there are no absolute moral truths in ethics. However, each of these claims is an absolute truth claim. So, according to relativism, these claims are also false. So, relativism is self-refuting in either case. There are also other fundamental difficulties with relativism. For example, logically, any relativistic belief can be expressed P and not P, which is a contradiction. And if you've studied logic, you know that a contradiction is always false. There are other forms of relativism with more persuasive thrust than these, but arguably they all boil down to these same fundamental difficulties. For example, cultural relativism has some pull for many people, but it doesn't go very far when we discuss cultural practices like forced genital mutilation, honor killings, and, I just fill in your own example. At a certain point, some things just seem wrong. Turning now to the Euthyphro dilemma and divine command theory. Divine command theory is only as complicated as the religion behind it. The theory basically states that what is moral is what God commands, and what God commands is moral. So, if your religion provides a list of rules to follow, determining what actions are moral is pretty straightforward. Of course, we can complicate everything with extreme examples and shuffling words around, but that's the gist of it, and that's all we need for now. So, what is the Euthyphro dilemma, and what does it have to do with this elegant theory? I'll leave out the backstory, but in this dialogue, Euthyphro claims to know everything about the gods and piety, what we would call today holiness. So, halfway through a discussion with Euthyphro about piety, Socrates shifts gears and asks a question that is always difficult at first read. Socrates asks, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Applied to modern religious thought, this question could read, does God love what is good because it is good, or is it good because it is loved by God? Plato realized the complexity of this question when he wrote this, so he has Socrates provide a confused Euthyphro some examples, such as a thing being carried. Is it carried because it has the nature in itself to be a carried thing, or is it a carried thing because someone is carrying it? Of course, a carried thing is carried because someone is carrying it. And when Euthyphro comes to understand the question, he says that the good, or holiness, is the opposite, namely, that the gods love it because it is good or holy. That is to say, holy or good things have holiness or goodness in themselves, and not because of something extrinsic to them. Of course, in the dialogue, this answer still leaves the question, what is holiness, open? But answering the other way would have its own complications and implications, as we'll soon discuss. Now, there's a lot that goes into religious thoughts on God, but in philosophy, we aren't necessarily beholden to any dogmas when discussing God. We aren't even necessarily discussing any particular God at all. It just happens to be the case that the God of the Abrahamic tradition shares defining characteristics with the so-called omni-God of philosophy. In philosophy, the nature of God that we are concerned with includes certain features like omnipotence, which means all-powerful, omniscience, all-knowing, omnipresence, all or always present, omnibenevolence, all or supremely good. Now that we understand Socrates' question and the nature of God, let's turn back to the dilemma. For clarity, this time let's phrase the question specifically for divine command theory, but it won't change any of the implications. This is just for clarity. Does God command something because it is moral, or is something moral because God commands it? Either of these disjuncts has their own implications. If God commands something because it's moral, then God's commands are superfluous to morality. If something is moral because God commands it, on the other hand, then morality is arbitrary. If you study logic, then you can see that this results in a constructive dilemma. Formally, it would look like this. Premise 1. P. God commands something because it's moral. Or Q. Something is moral because God commands it. Premise 2. If P. God commands something because it's moral, then R. God's commands are superfluous to morality. Premise 3. If Q. Something is moral because God commands it, then S. Morality is arbitrary. Therefore, either R. God's commands are superfluous to morality, or S. Morality is arbitrary. Either disjunct in this conclusion is problematic for divine command theory. Since it must be true that either P, God commands something because it's moral, or Q, something is moral because God commands it, it must be true that R, God's commands are superfluous to morality, or S, morality is arbitrary. If R, God's commands are superfluous to morality, then God doesn't seem to ground morality in the way this view purports. Worse still, it seems to put a limit on God's power to determine what is moral, and given the omnipotent nature of God, this horn presents an argument against the existence of God. If it's true that S, morality is arbitrary, then God could possibly will that the most horrible atrocities imaginable are moral, and as divine command theorists, however bad those things may be, we're basically obligated to call them moral. Furthermore, if God can make any atrocity moral, that opens the door to questions of God's omnibenevolence. So, this horn also presents an argument against the existence of God. Even though these views seem to be on opposite ends of the spectrum, Nietzsche's perspectivism on the relativistic side and divine command theory on the absolutist side, they're both very attractive to many people, if for nothing else, for their theoretical elegance. The answers are easy. What is moral is relative to each person on the one view, and what is moral is up to God on the other. The potential problems are difficult to see, but if you study philosophy, you might start finding problems everywhere, problems that were once invisible to you. And if you develop the right kind of eyes, you might find that the knobs and holes where everything is supposed to hold together are actually the lines where the theoretical elegance finally breaks and rolls back.